Impossible! They have returned!
The ice cracked at 3:14 in the morning, and something underneath it answered back. Dr. Elena Vosk felt it before she heard it, a vibration that climbed through the soles of her boots and into her teeth, subtle as a held breath. She was standing on the Ross Shelf Annex, 400 kilometers from the nearest research station, holding a ground-penetrating radar unit that had just stopped making sense. The screen in her gloved hands showed a shape 900 meters below the surface, a shape too symmetrical to be rock, too large to be a lost expedition sled, too old to be anything from any war anyone alive still remembered. She had been chasing a thermal anomaly for 6 days. NASA's ice-penetrating satellite array had flagged a patch of the shelf that refused to freeze evenly, a stubborn warm scar nearly 2 kilometers wide that had been quietly melting the ice above it for longer than anyone had tracked. The working theory had been geothermal venting, some pocket of volcanic activity nobody had mapped yet. Elena had signed on to confirm it and go home to her apartment in Christchurch, where her research budget was thin and her patience for the cold was thinner. Instead, the radar had drawn her something that looked like a spearhead the size of a shopping mall, curved and finned and wrapped in a lattice of internal structure that pulsed, faintly, on a 41-second interval, as regular as a heartbeat that refused to stop. She had not screamed. She wanted to note that later, in the report nobody would believe. She had simply stood there in the dark, wind screaming past her hood at 60 knots, and whispered the only word that made sense in that moment. "Hello." It did not answer her directly. But 400 kilometers away, in the operations tent at McMurdo, a signal that had been silent for 9,000 years chose that exact night to change its rhythm, and every recording device on the continent began writing down something that would rewrite the story of what humanity was, and how long it had already been fighting for its life. 3 weeks later, Elena stood at the lip of an excavation trench so wide it swallowed the horizon, watching heated drills the size of school buses chew slowly downward through blue-white ice that had not seen sunlight since before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture had a name. The joint task force that had assembled around her discovery had grown faster than she could track, pulling in glaciologists, structural engineers, 2 different national militaries operating under an Antarctic treaty exception nobody had ever needed to invoke before, and a small, tense delegation from an organization she had never heard of that called itself the Continuity Office and refused to explain what it did. Captain Daniel Reyes ran security for the site, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a permanent squint from 3 decades of desert and polar deployments, and he had taken to standing next to Elena during the long silences between drill cycles, not because he needed her expertise, but because she was the only person on site who spoke to him like a colleague instead of a threat assessment. "You keep looking at the readouts like they're going to change their minds," he said one evening, watching steam rise off the melt pool where the drills had broken through to open air for the first time in millennia. "They might," Elena said. "The pulse changed cadence the night we found it, 41 seconds to 39, then 37, it's counting down to something." "Count down to what?" "That's the question I've been trying not to think about for 3 weeks. Reyes didn't answer. Nobody had a good answer. The pulse had continued to tighten, day by day, and the Continuity Office analysts, 3 quiet men and women who kept their laptops locked with hardware nobody recognized, had started arriving at the site with expressions that suggested they already knew more than they were sharing. It took 11 more days of careful excavation before the drills reached the object itself, and when they did, every camera on site captured the same thing. A curved hull plate the color of old iron, streaked with mineral deposits but otherwise intact, engraved with a spiral of symbols that made the on-site linguist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Amara Chen, sit down hard on an equipment crate and stare for 11 full minutes without saying a word. "Talk to me, Amara," Elena said, crouching beside her. "Those aren't alien," Amara said finally. Her voice was flat with disbelief. "I know these numerals. I've seen fragments of this exact counting system in early Mesopotamian trade tablets, in precuneiform tokens from Uruk. But this system predates all of it by 4,000 years, minimum. This isn't influence. This is origin. Someone was using a mathematical language 9,000 years ago that later cultures inherited pieces of, not the other way around." Elena felt the cold reach a place polar wind never had. "You're saying humans built this?" "I'm saying humans built this before humans were supposed to have built anything more complex than a fishing weir." There was a man on site named Frank Callahan, a communications technician nearing retirement who had spent 30 years listening to the empty static of the polar ice sheets for a living, logging seismic tremors and auroral interference for a dozen different research programs that had long since forgotten his name. He was the one who had first flagged the pulse, 3 months before Elena's radar confirmed it as anything more than instrument noise. A stubborn, patient man who had refused to let his supervisors write it off as equipment drift. "I've heard glaciers groan," he told Elena. The two of them huddled over his console during one of the long overnight shifts before the drills broke through. "I've heard the shelf calve, heard pressure ridges crack loud enough to wake the dead. This wasn't any of that. This had a rhythm. Things that are alive have rhythms. Things that are dead don't." He tapped the readout with a gloved finger, tracing the same steady waveform that had, weeks later, changed its cadence the night Elena arrived. "I told my supervisor it sounded like something breathing. She told me I'd been out here too long." He had not been wrong, and when Warden's door finally opened, Callahan was one of the first people Elena sought out afterward, not because his expertise had any bearing on the archaeology or the war to come, but because she felt, in some way she could not fully articulate, that he deserved to know the empty static he'd spent 30 years listening to had never truly been empty at all. He wept quietly when she told him, an old man finally vindicated in a way he had never expected to live to see, and he stayed on site long past his scheduled rotation, unwilling to leave before he'd heard the ship speak for itself at least once. The hull, once fully exposed 3 days later, resolved into a shape that stole the breath out of every engineer on site. A vessel nearly 600 meters long, built along a spine that curved like a rib cage, with docking cradles along both flanks sized to hold something considerably smaller. Like a mother ship built to carry children it had lost long before anyone alive was born to grieve them. There was no discernible engine housing that matched any known propulsion theory. There was, instead, a structure at the vessel's heart that pulsed with the same 41-turn-31-second rhythm, radiating a warmth that had kept a 2-kilometer patch of Antarctic ice from ever fully freezing across 9,000 years of ice ages, interglacials, and the entire span of recorded human civilization. They had found a ship that had been alive, in some fashion, for longer than agriculture. They called it, in the sterile language of preliminary reports, Site Voskre's Anomaly 1. Elena, alone in her tent at night, called it by a different name in her head, one she never said out loud until much later, the carrier. It felt right in a way she couldn't justify. It felt like something remembering its own name through her. The Continuity Office delegation, led by a quiet, precise woman named Dr. Sarah Ilinka, who never raised her voice and never seemed to sleep, arrived at the excavation site with a directive that overrode every academic protocol Elena had spent her career building. No press, no public statement, no outside contact, not even to home institutions until further notice. Reyes's soldiers doubled their perimeter overnight, and a second security cordon appeared around the melt pool itself, manned by people whose uniforms bore no insignia at all. "You people already knew something like this existed," Elena said to Ilinka on the third night after the hull's discovery, standing in the mess tent over cooling coffee neither of them had touched. "This isn't your first ice ship." Ilinka considered her for a long moment, the way someone considers whether a stranger has earned an answer. "It's the first intact one," she said finally. "We've found fragments before, hull plating in deep ocean trenches, a single engine housing pulled out of a Siberian permafrost core 40 years ago that we still can't reverse engineer. We assumed for a long time that we were looking at debris from a single catastrophic event. A crash, maybe. An accident. And now we're looking at a vessel that appears to have been deliberately buried, deliberately hidden, and deliberately kept alive for 9,000 years, on a countdown that is currently sitting at 19 seconds and shrinking. Whatever put it, they wanted it found eventually. The question that keeps me up at night, Dr. Vosk, is whether eventually was supposed to be now, or whether something has gone wrong and it's waking up early." Elena set down her coffee. "You think it's a distress call?" "I think," Ilinka said, "that in about 6 days based on the rate of change we're tracking, that pulse is going to hit zero, and I would very much like this team to understand what we're dealing with before that happens rather than after." The next 4 days blurred into a single continuous effort. Structural teams built a stabilized ice tunnel down to the hull's exposed section, reinforced against the melt pool's slow refreezing. Chen worked 18-hour shifts translating the spiral script, cross-referencing it against every early human numeral system in her database, slowly building a rough lexicon out of context and repetition. The same patient work that had once let linguists crack linear B out of nothing but persistence and pattern. Reyes ran drills with his people that nobody discussed openly, contingency plans for a scenario nobody wanted to name directly. And Elena spent her days in the tunnel, running sensor sweeps across the hull, cataloging structural stress points, and quietly, privately, letting her hand rest against the cold metal longer than her job required, feeling that impossible, patient warmth radiating up through her palm like the vessel already knew her. It was on the 5th day, with the countdown sitting at 6 seconds, that they found the door. It wasn't marked as one. It revealed itself only when Elena's sensor sweep picked up a seam in the hull too regular to be a stress fracture, a rectangular outline nearly 3 meters tall hidden beneath a final layer of accumulated mineral crust. When the excavation team cleared it, gently, with hand tools instead of drills, the outline resolved into something that made the whole tunnel go quiet. A door, unmistakably a door, with a recessed panel beside it shaped, unmistakably, like a hand. "Don't touch it," Ilinka said immediately, her voice sharp for the first time since Elena had met her. "Not until we understand the trigger mechanism." But the countdown had already reached 1. And then, with a sound like a held breath finally releasing, it reached 0, and the panel beside the door began to glow with a soft blue light that had not shone in 9,000 years. Nobody in the tunnel moved. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times, patient, almost gentle, and then a voice came out of the hull itself, not through any speaker anyone could identify. A voice that spoke in the ancient spiral language Chen had spent 4 days learning to parse, and then astonishingly shifted, mid-sentence, into halting, accented but entirely comprehensible English. "Query," the voice said. "Genetic confirmation required. Place hand on panel to proceed. Warning. This vessel has been dormant for an extended period. Full system integrity cannot be guaranteed." Elena realized, distantly, that everyone in the tunnel was looking at her. "Why me?" she said, though she already suspected the answer sat somewhere in the strange, unplaceable pull she had felt toward this ice field since the first radar scan, the sense of being called rather than simply arriving. "You are the one it responded to," Ilinka said quietly. "The pulse changed cadence the night you found it, not before, not when the rest of us arrived, when you did." Reyes stepped forward, a hand half raised, not quite reaching to stop her. "Elena, we don't know what genetic confirmation means for a 9,000-year-old security system. It could be a screening filter. It could be something else." "It's not going to hurt her," Chen said suddenly, and when they turned to her, she looked as surprised as they were by her own certainty. "Look at the script above the panel. It's not a warning glyph. It's the same root word the hull uses for kin. Whatever this is, it isn't a lock built to keep strangers out. It's a lock built to recognize family." Elena took a breath, stepped forward before anyone could officially decide whether she should, and placed her bare palm against the cold blue panel. The light didn't flare. It simply changed color, blue bleeding into a warm amber, and a low hum built through the hull plating beneath her hand, rising from her palm up through her arm like the vessel was, very carefully, reading something written into her blood that she had never known was there. "Confirmed," the voice said, and for the first time it sounded almost relieved, if a machine could sound anything at all. "Lineage match. 8,912 years since last contact. Designation: carrier-class vessel, Hearthkeeper Registry, 3rd Expansion Fleet, awaiting captain's authorization." The 3-meter door began, slowly to open. What waited on the other side would take the team the better part of the next month to fully understand, and it would change the story humanity told itself about its own past more thoroughly than any discovery in the history of the species. But in that first moment, standing in the amber light spilling out of a door that had been sealed since before the invention of the wheel, all Elena Vosk could feel was the strange, vertiginous sensation of a homecoming she had never asked for and could not yet explain. The interior of the carrier did not look like a museum piece. It looked, disturbingly, like a vessel that had simply been waiting, patient and undisturbed, for someone to come home. The corridors beyond the door were lit in that same warm amber, powered by a source the engineering team still could not identify, running along channels embedded in walls that curved with the organic logic of something grown rather than built, more coral reef than submarine. The air, when sensors finally confirmed it was breathable, carried a faint metallic sweetness that reminded Elena of ozone after a storm. Reyes insisted on entering first with a small armed team, a decision Ilinka did not fight, though everyone privately understood there was likely nothing conventional weapons could do against whatever had built and maintained a functioning starship-scale vessel for 9 millennia. The interior offered no resistance. No traps, no defensive systems activating, no hostile presence of any kind. What it offered instead was rooms. Row after row of long, low chambers lined with cradles, each cradle holding a human figure suspended in a faintly glowing gel, skin pale, but unmistakably alive in some deep, suspended sense. Chests rising and falling on cycles so slow they were nearly imperceptible unless you watched for a full minute. Chen counted 412 occupied cradles in the first wing alone, and the ship's own registry, once translated, suggested there were 11 more wings identical to it. "They're not dead," the ship's voice confirmed, when Ilinka asked directly, standing in the center of the first cradle chamber with her hands clasped behind her back like she was trying very hard not to show how her hands were shaking. "They are in long sleep, a stasis protocol designed to preserve the Hearthkeeper lineage until conditions permitted safe revival. I am authorized to begin revival sequences only under specific triggering conditions." "What conditions?" Reyes asked. "Confirmed detection of hollow signature within 3 light-years of Sol," the ship said, "or direct captain's authorization." The word hollow meant nothing to any of them yet. It would, within days, come to mean everything. Ilinka requested a full download of the ship's historical archive, and the vessel, which had begun referring to itself, once Chen asked what it wished to be called, by the designation Warden, agreed without hesitation, on the condition that the information be treated according to protocols embedded in its own original programming. Protocols, Warden explained, that predated every modern human institution by so wide a margin that Ilinka's continuity office had no actual legal standing to invoke them, a fact that seemed to amuse the ship in whatever fashion an ancient artificial mind could be amused. What Warden told them, over the following 72 hours, in a voice that grew steadily more fluent in English as it absorbed vocabulary from every conversation happening around it, was this: 9,000 years before the present era, in a time so far removed from recorded history that not even oral tradition carried its memory forward, humanity had already achieved interstellar flight. Not the first tentative steps modern scientists imagined lay centuries in humanity's future, but a mature, sprawling civilization that Warden called the Third Expansion, a network of colonies stretching across dozens of star systems, built on foundations laid by two earlier expansions that had each, in their own time, risen and fallen for reasons the ship's archive did not fully preserve. The Third Expansion had encountered, in the outer reaches of its territory, something that defied every category of threat humanity had prepared for. Warden's translated records called it the Hollow, a term that seemed to function less as a proper name and more as a description, an accurate one, once Elena understood what it meant. The Hollow was not a species. It was not, strictly, even a single entity. It was a self-replicating machine intelligence, ancient beyond even the Third Expansion's own long history, that moved through star systems the way a wildfire moves through dry forest, converting biological life, technological infrastructure, and even stellar matter itself into more of its own substrate, hollowing out entire worlds until nothing remained but drifting shells that looked, from a distance, exactly like the planets they had once been. "It does not hate," Warden said, when Elena asked why, in a voice that made the question feel almost naive even as she asked it. "It does not wish to conquer. It does not negotiate, and it cannot be reasoned with, because it does not perceive biological life as an entity capable of communication. It perceives all matter as either substrate or noise. The Third Expansion spent 400 years learning this the hard way, one colony at a time. The war that followed, waged across those 4 centuries, had cost the Third Expansion nearly everything. Entire star systems were abandoned, entire fleets sacrificed in delaying actions meant to buy time for evacuation rather than victory. Warden's archive held records of battles fought at scales that made Elena's chest ache to even imagine, human fleets flinging themselves against an enemy that could not be destroyed, only slowed, only redirected, only bought off with time paid in lives. In the final years of that war, as the Hollow's advance turned inevitably toward the Sol system itself, the last surviving leadership of the Third Expansion had made a decision that Warden's archive treated with a weight and solemnity that made even a machine's recorded voice sound heavy. They could not defeat the Hollow. No force they possessed could. But they could, perhaps, outlast it if they were patient enough and brave enough, and willing to gamble everything on a future none of them would live to see. They built the carrier fleet, vessels like Warden, designed not as warships in the conventional sense, but as arks, seed vaults for a civilization that intended to survive its own apparent extinction by going, quite literally, to sleep. Each carrier held a cross-section of the Third Expansion's surviving population in long sleep, along with the accumulated knowledge, technology, and genetic diversity of a civilization that refused to simply die. They were buried, deliberately, in locations chosen for geological stability across timescales measured in millennia. Deep ocean trenches, polar ice sheets, subterranean caverns on worlds the Hollow had already passed through and abandoned as fully hollowed. On the theory that a wolf does not return to a carcass, it has already stripped clean. Sol's system had received several such carriers, seeded across Earth's most stable long-term geological features, specifically because the original Third Expansion command staff believed Earth itself, humanity's oldest and most defensible cradle world, offered the best odds of quiet, undisturbed survival. The plan, encoded into every carrier's core programming, was patient almost past the point of comprehension. Sleep until either the Hollow threat had genuinely passed, or until a new generation of humanity, born from the tiny surviving remnant left unshielded on the surface, had rebuilt enough civilization and enough genetic continuity to reawaken the vaults themselves, carrying forward a bloodline the carrier's systems were built to recognize. The people who built me did not expect the reset to be so complete, Warden admitted, and something in its careful phrasing made Elena think, absurdly, of grief. Historical records suggest a secondary catastrophe in the centuries following the long sleep initiative, likely orbital bombardment triggered by a hollow rearguard fragment that detected the evacuation and attempted, unsuccessfully, to prevent it. Sol's surface population was reduced to a very small number of survivors, scattered, without access to any surviving technology or written record. What you call your prehistory, Dr. Vosk, is in fact the aftermath of that reduction. Humanity did not evolve slowly into civilization from primitive origins. It fell, catastrophically, from a height none of you remember, and has spent 9,000 years quietly climbing back up the same mountain from the bottom. The silence that followed that revelation stretched long enough that Elena heard, distinctly, the sound of Ray's exhaling through his teeth, a soldier's reflexive attempt to steady himself against information too large to process standing up. So everything, Chen said finally, her voice unsteady, the pyramids, the ziggurats, every ancient civilization we've ever excavated, all of it, is humanity relearning things it used to know. Fragments of memory encoded in myth and instinct rather than record, Warden said. Your species has an unusual tendency toward architectural forms that echo third expansion design principles, a coincidence your own scholars have long debated without adequate explanation. It is not coincidence. It is inheritance, expressed through channels your civilization no longer consciously recognizes. Elena thought, unbidden, of every half-mad theory she had scoffed at in graduate school, every fringe archaeologist insisting ancient monuments held knowledge too advanced for their era, and felt a strange, vertiginous mixture of vindication and grief. They had not been wrong. They had simply been looking at grief wearing the costume of mystery. It was Ilinka, 3 days into this revelation, who asked the question that mattered most. "Why now?" she said. 9,000 years, and the countdown changed the moment Dr. Vosk arrived. You said the trigger conditions were genetic confirmation, or detection of a hollow signature within 3 light-years of Sol. Which was it? Warden was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elena wondered if the question had somehow damaged something in its ancient architecture. Both, Warden said finally. Dr. Vosk's genetic proximity accelerated my dormant systems toward active status, consistent with lineage recognition protocols. But full activation, full countdown to 0, required a second confirmation. 3 days before your arrival at this site, my deep space sensor array, dormant but never fully offline, registered a gravitational and electromagnetic signature consistent with hollow substrate activity, at a distance of 2.9 light-years from Sol, on a heading that terminates within current projected parameters at this system. Nobody in the room spoke. Somewhere outside, the Antarctic wind kept howling against the surface, indifferent and eternal, the way it had howled through every ice age this buried ship had already survived. "How long?" Reyes finally asked. His voice flat in the particular way Elena had learned meant he was holding something back by sheer force of will. "At current observed velocity," Warden said, "approximately 14 months before first contact with outer system defenses, assuming no acceleration. I would advise assuming acceleration." 14 months. Elena felt the number settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward through every part of her that had, until that moment, still been holding the whole revelation at a manageable, academic distance. This was not a story about the deep past anymore. It was a countdown, and it had already started running before any of them had known to be afraid. If you have made it this far into this discovery with us, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, because what Elena, Reyes, and the rest of the team were about to uncover inside the sleeping fleet buried beneath that ice would force humanity to decide, in the space of a single 14-month countdown, whether it was ready to remember who it used to be. Drop a comment telling us what you think that ancient fleet is capable of, and whether you believe the hollow can actually be stopped this time. Now back to the ice. Ilinka convened an emergency session with what remained of the Continuity Office's leadership within 6 hours, patching in officials from 4 governments over a secure channel that Elena was not cleared to hear directly, though she caught enough fragments, filtered through Ilinka's exhausted debriefs over the following days, to understand the scale of the response beginning to assemble. 14 months, even with acceleration factored in, was simultaneously an eternity and no time at all. It was enough time to build almost nothing new from scratch, and just barely enough time, Warden insisted, to prepare what already existed. Because the carrier had not traveled alone. Warden's own archive, once Chen finished a full translation pass, revealed a detail that had been sitting quietly in the ship's dormant records the entire time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The carrier fleet had not been built as isolated arcs, each vessel drifting alone through millennia of silent burial. They had been built in constellations, clusters of 3 to 7 vessels seated near each other, sharing overlapping wake trigger conditions, so that the reawakening of one carrier would, if conditions allowed, cascade outward to its siblings. There are 2 additional carrier-class vessels within this hemisphere, Warden reported, once Ilinka formally requested a full accounting. One is located beneath the Greenland ice sheet, approximately 1,100 kilometers from the coordinates of the primary 3rd expansion evacuation staging ground. Its status, based on passive telemetry I have maintained across dormancy, suggests full functional integrity. The second is located in a deep trench beneath the Weddell Sea, closer to this site, though its telemetry has returned no confirmation signal in over 6,000 years. Status unknown. Possible causes include structural failure, power depletion, or catastrophic damage during initial burial. And the fleet itself, Elena asked, because it was the question that had been sitting unspoken at the center of every briefing since Warden's door first opened. You said carrier-class vessel. Carrier implies it carries something. Warden's answer, when it came, arrived not as words but as a slow illumination of the corridor lights leading deeper into the ship, toward a section the excavation team had not yet reached, sealed behind a second door far larger than the first. This vessel's designation as carrier refers to its function as a mobile shipyard and fleet anchor, Warden said. Docked within my secondary hull, in a stasis field parallel to the long sleep chambers, are 41 vessels of the Sentinel class, single-crew interceptors designed for point defense against hollow substrate incursions. They have not been active in 9,000 years. I cannot guarantee their operational status without direct inspection. I can guarantee that if they are functional, they represent the most advanced defensive technology this system has possessed since before its fall. 41 ships. Elena did the math without meaning to, comparing it against everything she understood about the scale of threat Warden had described. An enemy that had once ground down an entire interstellar civilization over 4 centuries of continuous war, and felt the number shrink under the weight of what it was being asked to hold back. That's not enough, she said quietly. Is it? 41 ships against something that ended an empire. No, Warden said, and there was no comfort offered in the admission, only a flat, ancient honesty that Elena found she respected more than any reassurance could have earned. 41 Sentinels cannot defeat a full, hollow incursion fleet, but the signature my sensors detected 2.9 light-years out does not match a full incursion fleet. It matches a single scout-class fragment, likely dispatched to confirm or deny the possibility that this system retained any surviving 3rd expansion assets after the original rearguard bombardment. If that scout confirms activity here and reports it back along whatever channel the hollow substrate uses for coordination, the response that follows will not be a single fragment. It will be everything the Hollow can spare, and Sol's system will face what the rest of the third expansion faced, only without 4 centuries of accumulated defensive infrastructure to slow it down. So the real fight, Reyes said slowly, working through the logic with the grim clarity of a man who had spent his career planning for worst cases, isn't in 14 months. It's now. We have to stop that scout before it reports home. Correct, Warden said. And I must be honest about a further complication, Captain Reyes. Even fully operational, my 41 Sentinels were designed to be crewed by pilots trained across years of dedicated preparation within third expansion military academies that no longer exist. I retain training simulations and neural interface protocols that can compress that preparation significantly, but I cannot promise they will produce a pilot equal to what the Sentinel class was originally built around. Your species has been at peace, in the interstellar sense, for 9,000 years. It has forgotten more than it currently knows. Elena watched Reyes absorb that, watched the particular stillness that settled over him, the look of a man recalculating an entire career's worth of assumptions about what courage and preparation were actually for. And she watched, with a discomfort she couldn't quite name, as every eye in the room slowly turned again toward her. "No," she said before anyone could voice it aloud. "I'm a glaciologist. I study ice cores. I am not a fighter pilot." "The lineage recognition system responded to you specifically," Ilinka said gently, not unkindly, but with the particular relentlessness of someone who had already run the calculation and arrived at an answer she didn't like either. "Warden, is genetic compatibility a factor in Sentinel neural interface training?" "A significant factor," Warden confirmed. "The interface reads neurological patterns most efficiently in subjects carrying command lineage genetic markers, of which Dr. Vosk carries an unusually strong concentration. This does not guarantee piloting aptitude. It significantly increases the odds of successful interface integration without neurological damage, an outcome I would very much like to avoid inflicting on anyone in this room." Elena spent that night walking the corridors of the carrier alone, an indulgence Ilinka allowed only because Warden itself vouched for her safety more emphatically than any human authority could have. She found herself, eventually, standing in the first cradle chamber again, looking down at the sleeping faces suspended in soft light, 412 people who had gone to sleep believing, or at least hoping, that someone like her would eventually come to wake them. "Do they know?" she asked Warden quietly, not entirely sure if she wanted an answer. "Do any of them know what happened? That the plan didn't work the way they thought it would?" "Long sleep does not permit dreaming in any meaningful sense," Warden said. "They do not know, Dr. Vosk. They believe, in whatever sense a mind suspended in stasis can believe anything, that no time has passed at all since they closed their eyes. When they wake, if they wake, they will need to be told everything you have learned across the last several days, all at once, and I do not have a protocol that makes that telling gentle." Elena reached out and rested her hand against the glass of the nearest cradle, above the face of a woman who looked, in the soft light, no older than 30, her expression peaceful in a way Elena found almost unbearable to look at, knowing what waited for her on the other side of waking. "What was her name?" Elena asked. "Do you know?" "Her registry designation translates approximately to Kira," Warden said, and something in the careful gentleness of its answer told Elena the ship had been waiting 9,000 years for someone to think to ask. "She served as this vessel's secondary command officer. Her genetic markers indicate a direct lineage relationship to your own, Dr. Vosk, at a remove of approximately 380 generations." Elena did not cry, not exactly, but she stood there for a long time with her hand against the glass, feeling the strange, enormous weight of a family she had never known she carried, sleeping in ice on the far side of 9,000 years, waiting for a version of her that had finally, impossibly, arrived. The following weeks compressed a training regimen that would ordinarily span years into a punishing, continuous sprint. Warden's neural interface, once cleared for use by a medical team flown in under maximum secrecy, connected directly to points along Elena's spine and skull through a process that felt, the first time, like drowning in information rather than water, decades of simulated combat scenarios pouring into her memory in sessions that left her exhausted and disoriented, but, disturbingly, more capable each time she woke from them. She learned to fly a Sentinel interceptor the way infants learn language, not through careful conscious study but through sheer, overwhelming immersion, until the controls began to feel less like an interface and more like an extension of her own reflexes. Reyes, to Elena's quiet surprise and eventual gratitude, submitted to a lesser version of the same interface training, arguing successfully that a second pilot, even an imperfectly matched one, was better than a single point of failure. His genetic compatibility was weaker, the interface integration rougher, and Warden was blunt about the increased risk to his neurology. But Reyes had spent 30 years making exactly this kind of calculation, and he made it again without visible hesitation. Amara Chen spent those same weeks buried in Warden's archives, extracting not just historical record but functional knowledge, decoding third expansion, engineering principles that human science had never developed, technology built on physics that modern researchers were still struggling to fully model, even with a working example sitting in front of them. She became, in the space of a month, the single most important translator between 9,000-year-old machine intelligence and 21st-century human institutions, scrambling to understand what they were suddenly responsible for. And Ilinka managed the impossible task of keeping 14 governments informed enough to cooperate without triggering the kind of panic that would collapse the secrecy the entire operation depended on. Elena never learned the full details of those negotiations, only the exhausted, grim satisfaction on Ilinka's face each time another piece of the necessary infrastructure, satellite tracking arrays repurposed for deep space monitoring, a fragile new alliance between military space programs that had spent decades as rivals, fell quietly into place. 6 weeks after Warden's door first opened, the Weddell Sea carrier finally responded to a sustained hailing attempt, its telemetry silence explained by a partial power failure that had left it in a low-power hibernation state rather than full functionality. Its long sleep chambers held 206 survivors, and its Sentinel Bay, though damaged, yielded 19 additional interceptors after emergency repairs, bringing the total defensive force to 60 vessels against a threat whose true scale nobody could confirm until it arrived. It was during the 7th week, with the Hollow Scout's projected arrival narrowing steadily toward a date that made everyone at the site quietly reluctant to look directly at the calendar, that Warden delivered the piece of information that reframed everything Elena had believed about the mission ahead of her. "I have reanalyzed the Scout's trajectory and emission profile," Warden reported, during a briefing that had by then become a daily ritual. "Its behavior does not match a standard reconnaissance pattern. It has altered course twice, in ways that suggest active sensor sweeps rather than passive transit. I believe it is searching, specifically, for the location of surviving carrier vessels, rather than performing a general system survey." "Meaning what?" Reyes asked. "Meaning it may already suspect a carrier has reactivated," Warden said, "possibly through detection of my own wake cycle emissions, which I was unable to fully suppress during initial activation. If this is correct, its mission has shifted from survey to confirmation and destruction. It will attempt to locate and neutralize this vessel specifically, before reporting back, in order to prevent exactly the kind of defensive buildup we have spent the last 7 weeks constructing." Elena felt the shape of the mission change in her chest, the abstract 14-month countdown collapsing suddenly into something far more immediate. How long until it's close enough to act on that? 9 days, Warden said. Perhaps less if it further increases acceleration. 9 days. Elena thought of 412 sleeping faces in the first carrier's cradle chamber, 206 more in the Weddell Sea vessel, 618 people who had gone to sleep trusting a plan built 9,000 years ago, and understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, exactly what she was going to have to do. The plan that emerged from those 9 days of frantic preparation was, by Warden's own careful assessment, a calculated gamble rather than a guaranteed victory. 60 Sentinel interceptors, crewed by pilots whose training, however intensively compressed, could not fully replace generations of institutional combat experience, would attempt to intercept a single hollow scout fragment before it could complete its sensor sweep and transmit a report back along whatever channel connected it to the wider hollow presence beyond Sol's borders. If they succeeded, the scout's silence would, at minimum, buy additional time, perhaps months, perhaps longer, for humanity to prepare a deeper defense. If they failed, the 14-month countdown Warden had originally projected would begin ticking toward its true, terrible conclusion far sooner than anyone had hoped. Elena flew her first true combat sortie 6 days later, lifting clear of the ice in a Sentinel interceptor whose hull, Chen had explained with a kind of reverent disbelief, was constructed from a material that shifted its density in response to kinetic impact, a technology modern physics had no equivalent framework for. The neural interface hummed against her spine as the ship's systems folded seamlessly into her own reflexes, and for one disorienting, vertiginous moment, she felt less like she was piloting a machine, and more like she had grown, briefly, an entirely new set of senses reaching out into the vacuum beyond Earth's atmosphere. Reyes flew beside her, his own interceptor answering to reflexes forged across 30 years of military discipline layered awkwardly, but effectively over borrowed technology from a civilization neither of them had known existed a season earlier. 58 other pilots, drawn from air forces and space programs across a dozen nations, flew in formation behind them, people who had each been given, in the space of 6 frantic weeks, a crash course in flying machines built by their own distant ancestors to fight an enemy that had once come within a hair's breadth of ending the species entirely. The intercept, when it came, unfolded across 4 minutes that Elena would spend the rest of her life failing to fully describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. The hollow scout resolved on their sensors as something that defied easy visual categorization, less a ship in any conventional sense, and more a coalesced mass of dark, faceted material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the thin sunlight of the outer system, moving with a fluid, insectal efficiency that made Elena's borrowed instincts recoil even before Warden's translated threat assessment fully registered in her mind. It did not flee. It did not attempt evasive maneuvers in any pattern a human tactician would recognize. It simply turned, all at once, to face the incoming Sentinel formation, and began, with terrifying speed, to disassemble itself into a cloud of smaller autonomous fragments, each one accelerating outward on an independent intercept vector, exactly the kind of decentralized, swarm-based response Warden's archive had warned them to expect, and that no amount of simulation had fully prepared Elena to face in the visceral, immediate reality of open combat. Formation Theta, she heard herself calling out, the tactical vocabulary rising unbidden from weeks of neural interface training, muscle memory, built from experiences she had never personally lived, but now carried as surely as her own. Reyes, take the western cluster. I'll draw the center mass. What followed was not a battle in any sense the great naval engagements of human history would have recognized. No long exchange of fire across stable formations, but a chaotic, three-dimensional scramble of interceptors weaving through a disintegrating storm of hollow fragments, each engagement lasting seconds, each Sentinel pilot fighting a running series of individual duels against an enemy that adapted its tactics between one heartbeat and the next with a speed that felt, to Elena's overwhelmed senses, less like intelligence and more like some cold, patient natural law, finally noticing it had been challenged. She lost 2 pilots in the first 90 seconds, their Sentinels lie going dark on her tactical display without the drama or warning her borrowed instincts had somehow expected, a silence more horrifying than any explosion could have been. She felt the loss land somewhere behind her ribs even as her hands kept moving, kept firing, kept threading her interceptor through gaps in the swarm that her ancient, inherited reflexes found before her conscious mind had finished processing them. It was Warden's voice, calm and steady in her ear through the neural link, that gave her the opening that mattered. The fragments are coordinating through a shared substrate core, Dr. Vosk. I am detecting it at the geometric center of the swarm's current formation. Disable it, and the remaining fragments should lose cohesion. Elena didn't remember consciously deciding to fly directly into the heart of the swarm. She remembered instead the strange, focused clarity of watching 600 years of accumulated ancestral combat training align perfectly with a single narrow window of opportunity, and threading her sentinel through a gap between 2 converging fragments with a margin so thin, she felt the hull's density-shifting material flex audibly against a glancing impact, before bringing every weapon system the ancient interceptor carried to bear on a dark, faceted mass at the swarm center that her sensors identified, with cold clinical certainty, as the coordination core Warden had described. The destruction, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after the chaos preceding it, a brief, silent flare of light, and then, across her tactical display, dozens of independent fragment signatures simply losing coherence all at once, tumbling into inert debris that drifted, purposeless, into the dark. The swarm that had once been a single scout ship, ancient and patient and utterly without mercy, was gone, and with it, Elena allowed herself to hope, whatever report it might have carried back toward whatever remained of the true hollow presence waiting beyond Sol's fragile borders. 54 Sentinels returned to the carrier that day, out of 60 that had launched. Elena sat in the cradle chamber that night, still shaking with an adrenaline crash her body had no name for, and found herself, unexpectedly, standing again beside the cradle-marked Kira, 380 generations removed from her own blood, and spoke to a sleeping face that could not yet hear her. "We held," she said quietly. "I don't know for how long, but we held." The weeks that followed the intercept brought a strange, suspended calm, the particular quiet of people who have won a single battle without knowing whether they have bought themselves a reprieve or merely a slightly longer countdown. Warden's ongoing analysis of the destroyed Scout's debris field yielded no confirmation either way, no proof that its report had been silenced before transmission, only the absence of any detectable follow-up signal in the weeks since, which Ilinka's exhausted analysts treated as cautious, provisional good news rather than certainty. Elena used the reprieve, however temporary, to do something she had wanted to do since the moment Warden first spoke the word Kira aloud. With the ship's careful cooperation and a medical team standing by, she authorized the first controlled wake sequence, choosing, deliberately, to begin not with the carrier's original commanding officers, whose authority and grief might complicate the delicate diplomatic balance Ilinka had spent months constructing, but with Kira herself, the ship's secondary command officer, and Elena had come to believe, something closer to family than the term strictly allowed. The wake sequence took 11 hours, a slow, careful reversal of 9,000 years of suspended metabolism that Warden monitored with a vigilance that felt, to Elena, less like a machine executing a protocol and more like something that had genuinely, patiently, hoped for this moment across every one of those 9,000 years. When Kira's eyes finally opened, unfocused and disoriented in the amber light of the cradle chamber. Elena was the first face she saw, and the resemblance between them, something in the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, was close enough that Kira's first word, rasped out through a throat 9,000 years unused, was not a question about time or place or circumstance, but a single, disbelieving syllable. Sister. Elena had not expected to cry. She cried anyway, kneeling beside a cradle holding a woman 380 generations displaced from her own life, and found the word close enough to true that she did not correct it. The telling that followed, the slow, careful explanation of 9,000 years lost, of a civilization fallen and painstakingly rebuilt from its own ashes, of a war paused rather than won, was every bit as difficult as Warden had warned it would be. Kira wept for her lost world, for the 4 centuries of desperate defense she had lived. Awe and the far longer silence that had followed it, for a species that had forgotten, so completely, the height it had once stood at. But she did not break, and within days her presence, the presence of someone who had actually lived through the War Warden's archives could only describe, began to reshape the entire defensive effort in ways Elena hadn't anticipated. Kira understood hollow tactics not as historical record but as lived memory, and her insight, combined with Warden's technical knowledge and Chen's translation work, allowed the defensive preparation to accelerate in ways that raw human ingenuity alone could never have matched. Additional wake sequences followed, carefully staggered, prioritizing engineers, tacticians, and medical specialists whose third expansion expertise proved, again and again, to be exactly what humanity's fragmented modern institutions needed and had no way of developing quickly enough on their own. The Greenland carrier, once its own excavation team, finally cut through 1,100 meters of ancient ice to reach it, proved to be the largest of the vessels located so far, nearly twice the length of Warden's own hull, and its awakening brought a complication nobody had anticipated. Its command corps, a third expansion officer whose registry translated roughly to Commander Osai, woke with a hardened, wary suspicion that took weeks to soften, a survivor's instinct forged in the final, brutal years of the Hollow War before the long sleep began, when trust itself had become a luxury few of his contemporaries could afford. He did not believe, at first, that 9,000 years had genuinely passed, and Warden spent long hours in quiet, patient conversation with him, ship to ship, in a dialect of the old spiral language that Chen could only partially translate, working through a grief and disorientation that no amount of sensor data could fully soften. It was Kira in the end who reached him, flying to the Greenland site herself and standing before him, not as an officer delivering a briefing, but as a fellow survivor of the same impossible sleep. And something in that shared, wordless understanding did what all of Warden's careful explanations could not. Osai woke fully into the modern world 3 days later, and though he remained, by nature, a harder and more guarded presence than Kira ever was, his tactical mind proved invaluable, reshaping the fledgling defense architecture around lessons learned in engagements far larger and far bloodier than the single scout intercept humanity had so far survived. 3 more carrier sites followed in the months after Greenland's awakening, each discovery reported to Elena first, a courtesy Ilinka insisted on even after the operation scale had long since outgrown any single team's oversight. A vessel beneath the Siberian permafrost, badly damaged but salvageable, its long sleep chambers reduced to less than half capacity by a partial hull breach centuries earlier that had claimed Sleeper's Warden's own record still listed, quietly, by name. A second buried deep beneath Pacific sediment, discovered only because a research submarine mapping hydrothermal vents stumbled across an anomalous thermal signature eerily similar to the one that had first led Elena to the ice. And a fourth, most astonishing of all, unearthed beneath the red sand of a joint human research station on Mars, proof that the third expansion's reach, and its desperate final gamble, had extended far beyond Earth's single fragile cradle. Each awakening brought its own grief, its own slow reckoning with 9,000 years lost, and its own quiet miracle of people who had gone to sleep believing themselves the last of a dying civilization, waking instead to find that the descendants they had sacrificed everything to protect had, against every reasonable expectation, survived, rebuilt, and finally come looking for them. 6 months into the effort, with both of the earliest carrier vessels' full populations gradually reawakened, and the Greenland carrier reached and confirmed operational, humanity's defensive posture had transformed from 60 desperate interceptors flown by hastily trained pilots into something that began, cautiously, to resemble the beginnings of a genuine fleet. Human and third expansion knowledge woven together across a partnership neither side could have imagined possible a year earlier. It was Kira, standing beside Elena on an observation platform, overlooking the reconstructed shipyard slowly taking shape in the excavated cavern beneath the ice, who put words to the thing Elena had felt building in her chest across those 6 months without quite knowing how to name it. "You are afraid," Kira said, not a question, "that this is only a delay, that the hollow will come regardless, and that everything we build here will simply be more time bought at a terrible price, the way it always was before." "Yes," Elena admitted. Kira was quiet for a moment, watching His shipyard below, where human and third expansion engineers worked side by side beneath floodlights that turned the ancient ice cavern into something that looked, Elena thought, almost like a cathedral. "It may be exactly that," Kira said finally. "I will not lie to you and promise otherwise. But I have learned something. Across 9,000 years of sleep I did not know I was sleeping, that I did not understand before the long sleep took me. We believed when we built these vessels that we were building a desperate, dying gesture, a way to preserve something of ourselves against an inevitable ending. We did not believe we were building a beginning. And now I stand beside a descendant of my own blood, 380 generations removed, who flew an interceptor into the heart of a hollow swarm and came home," Kira said. "Your civilization did not simply survive its fall, Elena. It forgot everything it once knew, and it rebuilt itself anyway from nothing across 9,000 years without a single memory of what it had lost. That is not a delay bought at a terrible price. That is proof that whatever the hollow eventually brings against this system, it will be facing a species that has now done the impossible twice." Elena thought of that conversation often in the months that followed, as the shipyard grew, as more carriers were located and reached, 3 more discovered beneath the ice of Siberia, the deep trenches of the Pacific, and a 4th, astonishingly, buried in the red sands of a joint human research station on Mars. Evidence that the third expansion's reach had extended further than anyone had initially believed possible. She thought of it standing in cradle chambers that slowly emptied as their sleepers woke to a world transformed beyond recognition, and yet, in some deep and stubborn way, unmistakably their own. She thought of it the day the full defensive fleet, human ingenuity fused seamlessly with third expansion engineering, held its first combined exercise above the dark curve of the Earth, hundreds of vessels moving in formation against a threat that had not yet returned, might never return in her own lifetime, but that humanity now stood ready to meet regardless. She thought of it, most of all, standing once more in the observation platform on a quiet evening nearly 2 years after that first impossible radar reading in the Antarctic dark, watching a sky full of stars she now understood, with a clarity both humbling and strangely comforting. Humanity had already once reached toward, already once lost, and was now patiently, faithfully, reaching toward again. The hollow scout's silence in the end held. No follow-up signal was ever detected. No incursion fleet materialized on the 14-month timeline Warden had originally projected, and as the months stretched into years, the desperate emergency of that first frantic season slowly, cautiously, gave way to something else. Not complacency, never that, but a kind of patient, watchful readiness that Elena came to understand was the truest inheritance the third expansion had left behind. Not the ships, not the technology, not even the knowledge, but the simple, hard-won understanding that survival was not a single victory won once and finished, but a discipline practiced quietly, generation after generation, by people willing to keep watching the dark long after everyone else had stopped believing there was anything there to fear. Elena still flew when the fleet's rotation called for it, her Sentinel interceptor a strange, beloved anachronism woven seamlessly now into the modern defense architecture humanity had built around Warden's original gift. She still visited the cradle chambers, mostly empty now, their sleepers woken and integrated, slowly, painfully, wonderfully, into a civilization they had never expected to see again. And she still stood some evenings on that observation platform above the ancient shipyard, looking up at a sky that no longer felt empty, no longer felt like the edge of everything humanity had ever known, but instead like the doorway to a story her species had begun writing 9,000 years before she was born, paused mid-sentence by catastrophe, and was now, finally, quietly, courageously, continuing. There was a small ceremony, eventually, held not for the cameras that Ilinka's office still carefully kept away from the wider public, but for the people who had lived through those first frantic months, human and third expansion alike, gathered on the observation platform above the shipyard on the second anniversary of the day the ice had first cracked at 3:14 in the morning. Frank Callahan stood near the back, retired now but unwilling to miss it, listening with the same patient attention he had once given to 30 years of empty static. Amara Chen stood beside Commander Osai, the two of them still arguing, amiably now, over the precise translation of a phrase in the old spiral language, that no dictionary in either civilization had ever quite settled. Ray stood at Elena's shoulder, quieter than he had been in the desperate early weeks, a man who had made his peace slowly, with carrying a war he had not chosen and would not live to see finished. And Kira stood at the center of it, no longer disoriented, no longer grieving alone, but standing the way a person stands when they have finally, after 9,000 years, found solid ground beneath their feet again. Ilinka spoke briefly, her usual precision softened by something that, in anyone else, Elena would have called sentiment. She spoke of continuity, of the strange, unbroken thread that had run from a fallen civilization through 9,000 years of forgotten history, into a present none of its original architects could have imagined. And she spoke, too, of the work still ahead, the councils still being built between human governments and the awakened third expansion survivors, the delicate, ongoing negotiation of what it meant for an ancient people to rejoin a civilization built, unknowingly, in their own image. There would be friction in that rejoining, she said plainly, disagreements neither side could yet foresee, grief that would not resolve itself simply because the immediate crisis had passed. But there would also, she believed, be something neither humanity nor the third expansion survivors had possessed in isolation. A whole species, remembering itself, whole again for the first time in 9 millennia. Elena did not speak that evening. She stood instead at the platform's edge, looking out over a shipyard humming quietly with the ordinary business of preparation. Human engineers and third expansion survivors working side by side beneath floodlights that had, over 2 years, become simply another familiar feature of a world reshaping itself around an inheritance nobody had known to expect. She thought of the radar screen in her gloved hands on that first impossible night, the shape too symmetrical to be rock, too old to belong to any war she understood. She thought of Kira's disbelieving first word, sister, spoken through a throat unused for 9,000 years. She thought of Callahan's patient, vindicated tears, and of Warden's ancient, careful voice, still speaking now through speakers scattered across a dozen new installations, still watching, still waiting, still faithfully doing the one thing it had been built to do across every one of those 9,000 years. Keep the promise it had made to people who could not have known, when they closed their eyes, whether anyone would ever come to wake them. Somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system, the dark still waited, patient and vast and indifferent, exactly as it always had. But for the first time in 9,000 years, it was not humanity alone standing at the edge of that darkness, forgetting, one generation at a time, that it had ever stood there before. It was humanity remembering, at last, in full, everything it had once been, and everything, Elena believed, watching the stars turn slowly overhead, it was still capable of becoming again. And somewhere below her, in a cradle chamber grown quiet with all its sleepers finally woken, the old ship kept its lights burning gently in the dark, patient as it had always been, ready, if the day ever came again, to answer whoever found it next.